Welcome to today's edition of the Author's Corner, brought to you by KNEO 91.7 FM, The Word. I'm Roberta Foster, and today I welcome Samuel Blumenthal to Author's Corner, and he has written two books, editions 1 and 2 of Once Upon a Time. They're both published by Redemption Press, and he'll tell you more about how to find the books at the end of the program. Here's a little bit about Samuel. He is a retired clinical psychologist who grew up in a Reformed Jewish home in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he still resides. The proud father of 3 grown sons and 2 daughters-in-law, he has 5 grandchildren. Well, after coming to faith in Christ at 45, he looks for every opportunity to speak and write about the God who pursued him and lovingly carried him back home. And so, Samuel, thank you so much for being with us here on Author's Corner.
You're very welcome.
So, you have 2 volumes of what you call a collection of short stories for those trying to find their way home. And so tell us a little bit about why you entitled it that and why you enjoy sharing the gospel through short stories.
Yeah, it's so as you already said, I grew up here in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a Jewish home, but Reformed, very involved in going to temple, but not religious at all. And came to Christ at the age of 45, and I just turned 70 in November. So May 3rd, actually, it'll be 25 years. I've known the Lord. And so God has, from the very beginning, God used stories in my life. Some from the Bible, for sure, but actually from Christian fiction, from the Chronicles of Narnia, from Hans Feet on High Places, which is an old allegory that some people may be aware of, and then movies like anything from the very beginning. And so at some point I just decided I wanted to start writing stories and hope that God uses them in other people's life like he has in mine. So I first started writing about 15 years ago, and it was a nonfiction book. It's still unpublished, about all of this, my story, how I came to faith, about the gospel, how the gospel is really a 4-chapter story, which, unless you understand all of it, it really doesn't make any sense. Creation, the fall, redemption through Christ, and then one day God's just going to restore it all. So the book is about that, my story. It's about other stories, and I could just it's not published. I still just couldn't get it as good as I wanted to, and I actually started to write short stories just to take a break from that other project, which I really thought was the main thing, and I just loved it so much. And then, God's used stories in my life that I've just continued. So the first volume was published in July of 2023. Second volume just came out in December, and have the third volume. Actually, it might not come out until the beginning of next year. In no rush, but I really have enough stories for another one.
Fantastic. So do your stories follow a theme in each volume, or are they do they cover just a myriad of different themes?
Yeah, they're all very different, and so what got me excited is they're like longer parables. In a parable, what's great about a parable is it's really just one idea that it's trying to get across. The short stories are longer, so you can work in a little bit more, but they all were inspired by some gospel truth. Some of them, were inspired of, like, what was the garden like before the fall? What was God's intention for us? So what is our core nature really like, untainted, by sin? And then the other ones are, most of them kind of happen, like most stories do, in the middle of our mess, as people who may know God, but who are still fallen, still struggling with sin, still need God's grace desperately, to be who we could be and should be. But they're from fairy tales to science fiction to that's what's so great. I mean, the message, is what it is. The context can be all kinds of things. And what I've really come to understand, and God showed me this by using stories in my life, what's incredible, you start looking at stories, and the great majority of stories, like, say, all the stories that were written by people. Most of them are written by people who do not, believe in the God of the Bible. But you look, not on the surface, but you look at the greater symbolism in these stories, and they all have God's story in them, one way or another. Usually just talking about how broken we are, and then God's grace, although they may not identify it as God's grace, humbles the main character, and usually by the end of the story, the protagonist is a kindler and gentler version of himself. And that kind of describes most stories. There's different versions, but which to me really kind of verifies the fact that deep down in our hearts, we all really know who God is, and we know what He values, and we know our story, with the story of the Bible. That we were not meant to be the way we are. Something happened to us to change us, and only God can help us going forward, which is incredible when you think about it, because a lot of these stories, and even movies too, it's incredible how producers and directors will say, well, I wrote this story because of X. I was inspired by this. And then you look at the story, and the story I just said is right there over and over again. They don't give God credit for it. They don't acknowledge, the desperate nature of kind of our lives because of sin. They don't see it as sin, but it's there,
Amen. Yeah. So I've been talking with Samuel Blumenthal regarding his books, Once Upon a Time, Volume 1 and 2, published by Redemption Press, and you're listening to Author's Corner, and I'm Roberta Foster. And you've kind of been saying this, but you have made the statement that you've begun to wonder if people might learn more about the big questions in life about God and His relentless pursuit of us from fiction than they ever will from just ideas or hearing other stories. Again, you feel that the gospel can be presented easily through stories for people to be able to grab a hold of.
Yeah, which is funny because I completely used to believe the opposite, and and for 10 years I was struggling to write this nonfiction book, thinking that people will really only understand the most difficult issues if you speak to them directly. And then I looked at my own life and how God has used fiction in my life over and over and over again. And how, thousands of stories He put in the Bible for that very reason. And, people talk to us more directly about stuff. We tend to get defensive pretty quickly, But somebody starts to tell us a story about somebody else, it can strike us in a different way. And then it's kind of still up, to us to be receptive if we are going to be or not, and if God's grace is going to use it. Yeah, I just really have begun to wonder if people don't learn more from fiction. Usually, what we think is that we watch stories and movies and read books really for entertainment. You may think it's also it's good for you in some way or some cultural way or aesthetic way, but yeah, I think we're drawn to stories more than people realize. It's really as if we know we need to better understand what God is saying to us, and He's speaking to us indirectly through story.
One of the statements on the front of your books is a collection of short stories for those trying to find their way home. And so what do you mean by finding their way home?
So that getting back to, Tim Keller and some others in an organization called the Gospel Coalition, who may have kind of popularized the phrase, the 4-chapter gospel, but a lot of people talk about it these days, that to really understand the Bible and our story and God's story, you have to understand it chronologically. And so we were meant, for a perfect world with a perfect relationship with a loving God. And we had better ideas, which set us on this different course. But God, redemptively, ultimately through Christ, and then one day He's going to restore everything. And so, in the deepest way possible, it means that one day we'll get back home to the garden. It'll be a different garden. It'll still somehow it's going to be perfect, and somehow we're not going to be able to screw it up this time.
Okay.
So, I don't understand that, with God, because I don't think He's going to take free will away from us, but somehow maybe we finally learned our lesson and we're going to behave. But that's ultimately what it means. It's a pretty popular phrase. I even remember the movie, if you remember the movie Patch Adams with Robin Williams. He's like a medical resident, and as the movie begins, he's narrating, and he has this phrase that he says, everybody, and he uses examples of all kinds of different people. Everybody's ultimately trying to find their way home. And so I think I think ultimately what it really means is the garden, back to who we were meant to be without all this struggle.
Okay. Well, I noticed that at the beginning of each story you have a Bible verse. And so did the story come first and then you added or found an appropriate Bible verse, or did you use the Bible verse to determine the theme of the story?
Yeah, I think that the stories really came first, but they're very true to those verses. The stories kind of came first. Actually, some of the stories were half inspired by song lyrics and movie lyrics, which are almost impossible to get permission to use verbatim. You can quote, from books, but song lyrics verbatim and lyrics from a movie. So like a lot, not completely inspired, because the stories are my stories, but the genesis of the idea, like a third of the time, came from songs. I'm really into bluegrass music, bluegrass songs and other songs, Beatles songs, movie lyrics that, like that Patch Adams, that really helped to inspire a story.
Great.
But you can't get permission to use it, so I did not. Yeah.
Right. So you just work around it and write a story. That sounds great. Well, I'm talking today with Samuel Blumenthal about his books. Once Upon a Time, it's volume 1 and 2. And so, Samuel, tell our listeners how they can find out more about these books.
Well, everything's on Amazon these days, so you can go there. Samuel Blumenthal, Ph.D., Once Upon a Time, volume 1 and volume 2. Also, Redemption Press is the publisher. You can find the books there as well. Also, on my website, which is samuelblumenthal.com, I do a twice-monthly newsletter you can subscribe to on, like, the power and meaning of story, a lot of the same stuff we've been talking about, but using stories and movies and stuff as an example, and to talk about God's truth and how He tries to communicate to us through story.
Fantastic. So one more time, the books are Once Upon a Time, Volume 1 and 2. And I've been talking with Samuel Blumenthal. We certainly do thank him for sending us copies of the books to talk about. And Samuel, thank you so much for inspiring us with your stories and maybe even encouraging others to write their stories.
Always. Thank you so much for having me.
And to our listeners, if you'd like to hear this interview again or possibly share it with another, you can find it on your favorite podcast platform or through kneo.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Roberta Foster on the Author's Corner. Join me again next time.
Do you have 5 minutes for God? I'm Pastor Ed Wilson, and I believe there's no better way to begin each morning than spending a little time with Him. That's why every weekday morning I bring you a short devotional broadcast designed just for that. Look up God's 5 minutes wherever you get your podcasts to kickstart your spiritual walk for each day, and we'll always do it in 5 minutes or less. Have you talked to God today?